For months, strangers had been trampling through my property, like it was a public path. Every morning, I'd see footprints cutting across my ranch trail, the dirt disturbed, my privacy invaded. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just a harmless shortcut. But then the notices started. The HOA claimed I was blocking community access, threatening fines, meetings, even legal action. How could they side with people trespassing on my land? I realized I had to take a stand. But little did I know, the moment I finally acted would unleash a chain of events that left the HOA scrambling and the entire neighborhood stunned. What happens when you push back against the people who think they control your life? I had always loved my home. Nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban enclave, my ranch-style property stretched across gently rolling land, with a winding trail that cut through my backyard, my personal sanctuary. Mornings were calm, with sunlight spilling over the horizon and the faint scent of wild sage drifting in from the hills. On weekends, I'd walk the trail with my dog, enjoying the solitude, the freedom of space that felt almost impossible to find in a community like ours. Life here was peaceful, predictable, and, most importantly, mine. Neighbors were polite enough, nodding from behind hedges or waving across the street, and the HOA mostly stayed in the background, sending occasional newsletters or reminders about landscaping standards. I liked it that way. The rules seemed harmless, even helpful, until one day I noticed something strange: faint tracks crossing my trail. At first, I dismissed them as kids exploring or neighbors stretching their walks. But over the following weeks, the footprints multiplied. It wasn't just a few wandering footsteps, it became a pattern. People were using my private trail as a shortcut, cutting across my land to save a few minutes getting from one street to another. At first, it was irritating but tolerable. Yet there was a lingering feeling, subtle but undeniable, that the boundaries I had always counted on were eroding. And then, almost out of nowhere, the HOA got involved. What started as harmless trespassing would soon become a full-blown clash. One that forced me to confront rules, neighbors, and authority in ways I never imagined. At first, I tried to handle it quietly. I politely spoke with neighbors who were taking the shortcut across my trail, asking them to respect my property. Most of them shrugged it off. Some laughed it off, and a few offered vague promises they clearly had no intention of keeping. The footprints kept appearing. The trail, once my peaceful refuge, felt violated, like someone was chipping away at the boundaries of my life. Then the notices started arriving from the HOA. At first, they were mild. Reminder: community access must remain unobstructed. I laughed it off. Access, I thought. This is my land. But it didn't stop there. Within days, the tone shifted. Fines were threatened for blocking community easement access, and I was summoned to multiple HOA meetings. Each notice carried a tinge of hostility, a sense that they were siding with the neighbors who trespassed on my property. The meetings themselves were surreal. I walked into the HOA clubhouse, expecting to discuss a misunderstanding, but instead, I was met with a wall of authority. Chairs were arranged like a tribunal, and the board members seemed almost eager to find fault. Their questions were pointed, their tone sharp. Every explanation I offered was dismissed as not in the spirit of community harmony. I tried to appeal to reason, showing property maps and clearly marking my trail as private, but the HOA had already picked a narrative. I was the problem. Tensions escalated further when a neighbor, who had long been vocal at meetings, made a thinly veiled threat. "You really shouldn't make this difficult for everyone," they said, smirking, their eyes scanning the room as if testing my reaction. The message was clear pushback, and there would be consequences. I realized then that this wasn't just about a trail anymore. It was about control, reputation, and power. The HOA wielded rules like weapons, and I was suddenly at the center of their crosshairs. Emails began pouring in almost daily. Some were polite, others passive-aggressive, and a few outright hostile. Every message made me feel like I was under siege. Photographs were attached, showing the trail, obstructed, as if my peaceful private land was a public menace. I responded calmly at first, pointing out the boundaries and the trespassing, but the HOA's replies became increasingly insistent. Threats of fines, liens, and legal action hung over me like storm clouds. The neighbors didn't help. Some began leaving notes on my gate, suggesting I was being unreasonable. Others openly walked across the trail when I was watching, almost as a dare. My sanctuary had turned into a battleground. Every time I tried to enjoy my property, I felt the eyes of the HOA and the neighborhood upon me. The trail became a symbol, a small stretch of land that had become the front line in a much larger struggle over autonomy and respect. Then came the tipping point. I discovered that the HOA had scheduled a board vote to declare my trail community easement, effectively taking legal control over it without my consent. They framed it as a technicality, a minor administrative adjustment, but the implications were enormous. If the vote passed, I would lose not just access control, but my ability to enforce privacy or stop trespassing. It was a calculated power move, and I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. I began documenting everything. Every footprint, every email, every notice. I mapped the trail, photographed evidence of trespassing, and carefully recorded HOA communications. The more I dug in, the more I realized how deeply the HOA's rules were structured to favor conformity over fairness. Petty regulations, obscure clauses buried in lengthy covenants, and the threat of fines, all designed to intimidate homeowners who dared to assert their rights. It was like navigating a legal maze with invisible walls. Neighbors' behavior worsened. Some started using my trail deliberately during peak times, almost to test my patience. I caught groups of them laughing as they took shortcuts, leaving litter behind. At one point, a neighbor even parked partially on my property while unloading groceries, daring me to say something. Each act of defiance stoked my frustration, yet I knew that reacting impulsively could be spun against me by the HOA. I had to plan, to wait, to prepare my counterstrike. Then came the public notice. The HOA sent a letter to the entire neighborhood, citing community concerns, and subtly implying that I was obstructing access. Suddenly, my private frustration became a public spectacle. Conversations in the street changed tone when I walked by. People whispered, some offering sympathy, others judgment. The sense of isolation was suffocating. I felt cornered, but a spark of determination ignited. I couldn't let bureaucracy and petty neighbor politics dictate what I could do on my own property. Late nights were spent poring over property records, HOA bylaws, and easement definitions. I began to see cracks in their authority, technicalities they had overlooked, loopholes I could exploit. It was like preparing for a chess match, each move calculated, each action measured. The HOA thought they had me boxed in, compliant and intimidated. They didn't realize that I was learning their rules better than they did. And I was starting to plan my next move. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I had a quiet confidence. The evidence was compiled, the violations documented, and the legal groundwork laid. But stepping into that room, facing the board and the crowd of neighbors, I still felt a knot of tension. The air was thick with expectation, suspicion, and judgment. Everyone waited for me to flinch, to back down. And that was when I realized something crucial. If I didn't act now, this battle wouldn't just be about a trail. It would be about my right to control my own life. The stage was set. The HOA believed they had the upper hand. The neighbors thought I was being unreasonable. And yet, beneath the surface, a quiet storm was brewing. What I did next would change the dynamic entirely, and it would leave them scrambling in ways they never saw coming. The day of the decisive HOA meeting arrived, and I could feel the weight of weeks, no, months, of frustration pressing down on me. The sun had barely risen, and already my stomach churned with anticipation. For months, they had dictated my life, threatened fines, and tried to turn my neighbors against me. Today, it would all come to a head. I arrived early, trail maps and photographic evidence in hand, ready for a confrontation that had been building like a storm. The HOA board members were already there, arranged in their usual authoritative semicircle, the same smug expressions, the same sense of superiority. Around them, the room was filled with neighbors, some curious, some judgmental, and a few clearly rooting for the board's version of justice. The meeting opened with the usual formalities, but it quickly became clear this was not going to be routine. The board president began by reading the official statement. My trail allegedly violated community easement regulations and interfered with neighborhood accessibility. Every word dripped with bureaucratic weight, designed to intimidate, designed to make me appear unreasonable. I kept my composure, but inside, my heart was hammering. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. Calmly, I stood and laid out the evidence I had meticulously gathered. Photographs showed the footprints cutting across my trail. Not just a few isolated tracks, but patterns of trespassing over weeks. Maps clearly marked property boundaries, recorded and notarized, proving that my trail was private land. I referenced HOA covenants, state property laws, and precedent cases where easement claims were denied, because the land in question was not legally designated as public access. For a few seconds, the room went silent. The board's smugness faltered, replaced with visible discomfort. One by one, I presented each piece of evidence, dismantling their claims with facts and logic that couldn't be ignored. Emails threatening fines were countered with legal citations showing the HOA's overreach. Their attempt to frame me as obstructive unraveled in real time. I could see the subtle panic spreading across their faces. They were used to compliant homeowners, not someone who had done their homework. Then a neighbor attempted to interject, arguing that community spirit mattered more than legal boundaries. I turned and addressed them directly, voice calm but firm. I explained how community spirit should never mean trampling someone else's rights or property, and I asked pointedly, if the roles were reversed, would they want strangers walking across their backyard unchecked? The room shifted uncomfortably, the hypocrisy was exposed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The board tried to regain control, citing procedural rules and attempting to dismiss my evidence as technicalities. That's when I dropped the bombshells. I had already filed an official complaint with the local property oversight office. They had received my documentation, and the HOA was being investigated for overstepping its authority. Gasps echoed through the room. For the first time, I saw uncertainty replace their usual certainty. The people who had tried to intimidate me were now scrambling, forced to confront the consequences of their own overreach. I didn't stop there. I revealed photos of neighbors deliberately using the trail as a shortcut during peak times, demonstrating that the supposed access issue was not caused by me, but by repeated trespassing, I had timelines, records of emails, and even witness statements from neighbors who supported my case. The board tried to interrupt, to regain control, but every argument they made was dismantled point by point. I felt a surge of vindication, a sense that all the late nights, all the research, all the tension, had been leading to this moment. The final turning point came when I presented the HOA with a simple, undeniable fact legally: I owned the trail, and any attempt to enforce easement claims without my consent was invalid. Silence fell. One by one. Board members avoided eye contact, their authority undermined in front of the entire community. I could feel the shift in energy. The balance of power had flipped. Then, in a moment that felt almost cinematic, a neighbor who had once mocked me stood up and publicly acknowledged the unfairness of the situation. Their voice carried across the rooms. I didn't realize how wrong this was. You've been nothing but patient. And they've been in the wrong the whole time. The statement broke the tension like a dam bursting, and others nodded, some murmuring in agreement. The HOA's position crumbled, their narrative exposed as pettiness cloaked in bureaucracy. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice but to concede. No fines were enforced. The easement claim was withdrawn, and the HOA had to formally acknowledge my property rights. But it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a public one. Their credibility was damaged, their aura of authority diminished, and I could feel a quiet sense of empowerment settle over me. Yet even as I walked out that day, victorious, a part of me knew the struggle had left a mark. The tension, the harassment, the sheer absurdity of their power plays. It was a reminder that control, bureaucracy, and pettiness can hide in places you least expect. But in standing firm, in refusing to let intimidation dictate my life, I had not only reclaimed my property, I had reclaimed my voice. As I returned to my trail that evening, sunlight filtering through the trees, footprints no longer marked the path. My sanctuary felt whole again, my privacy restored. But I couldn't help but wonder how many other homeowners silently endure the same battles, trapped by fear of fines, social pressure, or HOA overreach. And if one person can push back and win, what would happen if more of us demanded respect, boundaries, and fairness? The storm had passed, but the lesson lingered, a quiet, powerful reminder that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about property, it's about taking back your life. After the storm of confrontation had finally passed, the neighborhood slowly returned to its routines. The HOA, once a looming presence in my life, retreated into a quieter role, at least on the surface. I no longer received daily emails threatening fines or summonses to meetings. The trail, my sanctuary, was once again mine, untouched by the constant march of trespassers and the heavy hand of bureaucracy. Yet the resolution wasn't just about regaining a stretch of dirt and trees, it was about reclaiming autonomy, dignity, and a sense of justice that had been under siege for months. In the immediate weeks following the meeting, the shift in neighborhood dynamics was palpable. Some neighbors, previously vocal in their support of the HOA's overreach, grew silent when our paths crossed. The smug smiles and thinly veiled judgment faded, replaced by hesitant nods or even apologies. One morning, as I walked my dog along the trail, a neighbor I had clashed with months earlier approached me. I didn't realize how wrong this had gotten, they admitted quietly. There was no fanfare, no dramatic reconciliation, just an acknowledgement of a truth that had long been uncomfortable to face. Those small moments of recognition mattered. They reflected the subtle, but real way accountability rippled through a community that had once blindly followed authority. The HOA itself underwent changes, though less publicly. Behind closed doors, whispers of internal reviews and board members questioning their approach began to surface. Their credibility had been publicly undermined, and while some attempted to cling to their positions of influence, the confidence that had fueled their harassment of me and others was shaken. I knew that their tactics, once normalized, had finally been exposed for what they were: a misuse of authority, wrapped in rules and formalities, lacking genuine fairness or respect for the people they were meant to serve. For me, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but it was enriched by a deeper sense of ownership, not just of the land, but of my rights and my voice. Every morning, as I stepped onto the trail, sunlight spilling over the path, I felt a quiet pride in the stand I had taken. The trail, once a battleground, was now a symbol of resilience. It reminded me daily that even against institutions designed to intimidate, preparation, patience, and perseverance could tilt the scales. Over time, the lessons extended beyond personal vindication. Conversations with neighbors gradually shifted from passive complaints about rules to discussions about fairness, respect, and property rights. Those who had once supported the HOA's stance began to question the assumptions they had taken for granted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but over months, it became clear that the conflict had sparked a broader awareness. The ripple effect of standing up, even when the odds seemed stacked, was more profound than I had imagined. Legally, the outcome set a precedent in my little corner of the community. The HOA, now cautious in their approach, had to rethink how they enforced rules and handled disputes. I kept copies of all correspondence, board minutes, and official notices as a record, not out of fear, but as a reminder that knowledge and documentation are essential when dealing with entities that can easily overstep boundaries. Others in the neighborhood quietly benefited as well. Knowing that the HOA had been challenged successfully encouraged some neighbors to question minor grievances or unclear rules themselves, fostering a cautious but necessary empowerment. Yet the impact wasn't limited to the legal or practical aspects. Emotionally, the months of confrontation had taken their toll, leaving a lingering awareness of how vulnerable personal space can be when bureaucracy and petty politics collide. I had felt isolation, frustration, and even fear at moments, wondering if my private life would continue to be publicly scrutinized. But the triumph brought an equally powerful emotional resolution. A sense that courage, informed action, and unwavering adherence to truth could prevail, even when the system appeared overwhelmingly weighted against you. That awareness became a quiet but persistent force, guiding interactions, decisions, and even casual conversations. Interestingly, the neighborhood itself began to transform. Petty disputes, once magnified by the HOA's influence, diminished in intensity. Conversations became more nuanced, more thoughtful. Residents started to recognize that compliance without understanding, blindly following rules and siding with authority, could have unintended consequences. My stand had inadvertently fostered a subtle cultural shift. People began thinking twice before escalating minor disagreements, or turning to the HOA to settle personal grievances. Authority still existed, of course, but its misuse was no longer unchallenged. It was a change that wasn't dramatic, but it was enduring. In my own life, the experience left me more vigilant and assertive. The trail, now restored to its rightful use, became a place of reflection. I started documenting things more diligently, not just for protection, but to cultivate awareness and mindfulness in how I engaged with rules, neighbors, and community structures. Every footprint, every conversation, Every letter from the HOA had taught me the value of careful observation and deliberate action. I realized that standing your ground doesn't always require confrontation alone. It requires preparation, strategy, and clarity of purpose. Months later, I still noticed subtle signs of change in the community. Some neighbors had started small initiatives to improve communication without over-relying on the HOA. Community bulletin boards featured announcements with tone and clarity that were once lacking. The HOA, still in place but quieter, seemed more cautious about sending out letters or making unilateral decisions. It was as if the memory of my stand lingered, shaping behavior even without constant oversight. The trail, free of unwanted shortcuts and interference, stood as a quiet testament to how one person's persistence could catalyze change. The personal impact extended further than property boundaries. I found that asserting my rights strengthened my confidence in other areas of life. Decisions that once felt intimidating or bureaucratically daunting became manageable because I had learned that preparation and principled action could yield results. I also became more empathetic toward neighbors who might face similar struggles but lacked the knowledge or courage to challenge overreach. That empathy manifested in quiet guidance, sharing knowledge about property rights, HOA regulations, and ways to protect personal space without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Yet even with all the victories, I recognized the subtle scars left behind. Tension with some neighbors never fully dissolved. A few chose to remain distant, their trust eroded by the months of confrontation. But I found peace in accepting that resolution doesn't require unanimous approval. Some battles are won simply by reclaiming what is rightfully yours, and the opinions of those unwilling to acknowledge fairness are theirs to bear. Looking back, the most profound takeaway wasn't about winning against the HOA or even regaining the trail. It was the realization that the systems designed to maintain order can also amplify pettiness and overreach if left unchecked. And that individuals, armed with knowledge and courage, have the power to challenge them. The experience became a microcosm of a larger truth: boundaries, physical, emotional, and social, must be recognized and defended, or they risk being eroded by indifference, bureaucracy, or collective assumption. Now, when I walk my trail, the earth beneath my feet feels alive with both history and possibility. The footprints that once signaled intrusion are gone, but the lessons they left behind are permanent. Every branch that arches overhead, every patch of sunlight through the trees, carries a reminder that vigilance, preparation, and unwavering resolve are tools not just for survival, but for thriving. And perhaps most importantly, I've come to see that this story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt powerless under arbitrary authority, anyone who has faced rules that don't make sense or neighbors who overstep their bounds. It is a reminder that resistance, when guided by patience and principle, can produce lasting change. That one small act, blocking a trail, standing firm, speaking truth, can ripple outward, transforming relationships, reshaping communities, and restoring balance. The HOA learned a hard lesson about the limits of control. Neighbors learned a lesson about respect and fairness. And I learned something that can't be measured in legal victories or cleared trails: the power of standing firm, even when the path ahead seems intimidating. The trail is mine, but the victory belongs to anyone who understands that asserting your rights doesn't make you difficult. It makes you human. As the sun sets behind the hills, and the trail stretches quietly before me, I can't help but ask, how many others are quietly enduring similar battles, feeling powerless against rules, neighbors, or authorities that overreach, and what might happen if, like me, they chose to stand firm. Not with anger, but with knowledge, patience, and unwavering resolve. The answer is a story that's still being written, one step at a time, along trails that are, finally, respected.